That week when winter seemed to hold its breath, it exhaled with an anger that silenced the entire region of the United States. Tonight, we will drift together to January 1978, into the heart of the Midwest, where the snow is not just falling but conquering. The wind doesn't just blow, it also rewrites the rules of daily life. You might settle down after a long day, or you lie in the quiet darkness of your room, looking for something to relax and rest your brain. No matter what wind brings you here, I'm grateful that you chose to drift backward with me during this period, into a winter that most of us can only know about through photos and faded news reports. This is an epic and boring history. We don't seek thrills. We let peace unfold in every detail. Up to now, the weight of the world has decreased enough for sleep to come to you. Before we embark on this quiet journey through the icy and snowy years of 1978. So, when sleep becomes distant and your mind seeks refuge in the past, these forgotten fragments of the late night will always find your way. I'm really eager to know where you are now. Please leave a message to tell me your location and the time you are listening. Some of you may wake up in deep silence. Others might just start your morning with coffee and quiet lighting. There are still some people somewhere in between who haven't fully decided what they want for a day. No matter where you are a part of this moment, this collective returning to the embrace of history. Now, if you can dim the surrounding lights, perhaps you can turn on the fan or open the window to let the soft background hum from a sound cocoon around you. Let your shoulders clump, slow down your breathing, and get ready to face another kind of cold. The cold of winter redrew the map, causing the economy to stagnate in the modern world. Remember how fragile human control over nature is. We are going back to the major snowstorm in January 1978, which buried the Midwest under heavy snow, turning highways into abstract concepts, cities into silent white mazes, and freezing billions of dollars in the economy. It reminded Americans that weather, not politics or money, remains the ultimate authority of human planning. This is not merely a snowstorm. This is the pause but unpressed by civilization itself. A week minus long contemplation on the strange beauty of helplessness, patience and complete stillness. So now breathe slowly and calm yourself down. In the past I was patient. It awaits us in the space between wakefulness and sleep, where history becomes something we can almost touch, almost felt on our skin like snow blown by the wind. Tonight we will experience the meaning of getting through that week, not as onlookers, but as participants in the collective moment of surrenders to forces beyond human control. Let's get started. You wake up in the dark just as you would on a weekday morning. The alarm clock mechanically persists, and that tiny yet persistent ringtone pulls you out of the dream unfolding in your slumbering mind. It was very cold in the bedroom, just right, so cold that you didn't want to get out of the blanket you had covered all night. Your window, when you finally force yourself to look at it, has been etched by frost into complex patterns, ferns and spiral designs, which nature has painted on the glass while you sleep. Through the crystal barrier, you can see the street lamps at the corner, casting an orange glow onto the area that looks like it has just snowed. Just a few inches. Perhaps there's nothing unusual in Ohio in January. The weather forecaster warns that a storm is coming, but the weather forecaster always warns of storms in winter. You've learned not to panic over every prediction, not to rush to the grocery store with others, and not to peel off the bread in the aisle before it falls. This is winter in the Midwest. Snow is the language spoken by the sky, and you have learned to use its inconvenient words fluently. You lack practice in your morning routine, just like someone who has done it 10,000 times before. When you are dressed layer upon layer, coffee seeps over the stove. Undershirt, work shirt, sweater. The routine armor protects against January bites. The stove in the basement emitted a steady song. This ancient oil-minus burning beast can withstand the cold, but its annual breeding cost is higher, yet it remains irreplaceable. Your spouse has already gotten up. They have been up for 20 minutes and are preparing lunch for the children. The children are still sleeping in their own rooms, having no idea about the day ahead. You are quietly communicating with those who have lived together for a long time and whose efficiency has replaced complicated communication. You might ask, The road looks fine. Now the reply will tell you everything you need to know. The radio is playing on the shelf above the refrigerator. That familiar morning voice played in a loop between the news and the weather forecast, between the winter tire sales advertisement and the stove repair advertisement. The weather forecast changed overnight. What should have been just a few inches has now turned into 6 inches, or even 8 inches. They use terms like winter storm, surveillance, and travel advice. But these terms lost their sense of urgency due to overuse. You stand in front of the counter having breakfast and look out of the kitchen window. The world before your eyes begins to blur. The snow that seemed mild an hour ago has now fallen, even heavier. Now it is falling more purposefully and more firmly. The wind that didn't appear at dawn is now beginning to show up. You can hear it probing every corner of the house, trying to get in through the invisible gaps in your home's defense system. Your eldest child showed up at the door, already dressed for school, and asked the question you had been avoiding all along. There is still hope for this problem. For unexpected freedom. You may not tell them that the situation is not bad enough, although your intuition tells you that it is not. When you are ready to go to work, the outside world has already changed. The light snow 90 minutes ago has turned into something completely different. A white curtain veils reality, obscuring the familiar street landmarks. The car you parked in the driveway has turned into a blurry shape, a sculpture covered with snow. You put on your coat, boots, gloves and hat, and push open the front door. The wind immediately struck you, a physical force causing you to sway slightly, blowing the snow water flat onto your face. Precisely, Stu. This is different from the gentle snow you see at dawn. This is aggressive, purposeful and angry. It's only 20 feet to walk to your car, but it feels like crossing a frozen desert. In some places the snow is already as deep as your knees. The wind has blown the snow into piles of snow, and the speed at which more snow falls is even faster than the speed at which you track individual snowflakes. You walk to the car and start the winter survival ritual, scraping the ice off the windows, brushing snow off the hood and roof, and cleaning the exhaust pipe, because you've heard of people who didn't do this. They fell asleep in the idling car and never woke up again. The engine turned unwillingly, coughing, protesting, and then entered an uneven idling state. When you finish cleaning the windows, warm them up, even though the snow renews itself almost as quickly as you clear it. The temperature has dropped. You can sense it from the quality of the air. Your breath immediately freezes into tiny ice crystals, capturing the dim morning light. You were reversing out of the lane when your neighbor appeared. A black shadow in the white chaos is waving its arms to catch your attention. He was shouting something loudly, which you couldn't hear in the wind, and pointing at the street. You rolled down the car window and immediately regretted it. Snow rushed in as if it had been waiting for an invitation all along. "The road beside the church is impossible to walk on," he shouted. Jerry wanted to go over, but slipped into the ditch. "No one is allowed to go today." You nodded, rolled up the car window and sat there for a while. The engine was running and the wipers were on the windshield, engaging in a doomed battle with the accumulated snow. "This is my own decision. And after the return lane, turn off the engine, and then go home." Inside, when you reappeared, your family looked at you with different expressions, covered in snow and defeated. "Home," you announced, and the children's faces were filled with the joy of reaping without effort brought by the unexpected festival. You called your supervisor and waited for 6 rings before someone answered. Then you learned that the factory was going to close on the day when no one was around, because this decision should have been made several hours ago. The phone kept ringing that morning. School districts announced school closures, friends greeted each other, and relatives called from warm states where such weather only exists in imagination. Every conversation was filled with the same doubts and growing concerns. This is no ordinary snow. Everyone can feel it. When a certain feeling changes, one naturally decides to maintain oneself in a way that modern amenities cannot adapt to. By noon, you won't be able to see the other side of the street. Your house has become an island in the white ocean. All familiar landmarks have been erased by the storm's continuous rewriting of the visible world. The snow is no longer just falling. It moves horizontally, driven by the wind, which roars in the corners, finding every crack and every gap in your home's defense system. The power flickers once, twice, 3 times. Every flash will cause anxiety in your chest because you know what will happen next, and what will always happen next. In this case, you will find the flashlight, test the battery, and locate the candle and matches. Your spouse fills the pots, pans and bowls with water from the tap, while the electricity is still flowing and the pump of the well is still working. Although the illusion of autumn invincibility still exists, the house groans under the attack of the wind, creaking in a way you have never heard before. Even though you installed windbreaks last autumn, the window frames are still creaking, moving. The trash can, the lawn furniture you forgot to fix, the branches cracked by the ice. The soundscape of a storm is constant but ever changing. The wind was howling, the snow was hissing on the glass, and the house itself was protesting against this siege. Your children were initially happy about the unexpected rest day, but as morning came, they became quiet. They sensed the tension of adults. When they entered the room, the conversation turned into whispers. They frequently glanced at the window, only to see a white chaos. Try to stay on. It is suggested to play board games, bake cookies, turn on the TV and watch those cartoons that are out of place with the monochrome reality outside. You automatically record the time and mark the moments when your home is connected to a larger grid server when you were truly isolated. The TV stopped halfway through. The constant humming of the refrigerator stopped, and suddenly the room became much quieter. Despite the continuous howling of the wind, the only sounds were the natural wind and the creaking protest of this building, which had never been designed for such intense meteorological violence. You have already made preparations for this, but preparation only exists in theory until it is tested by reality. The flashlight worked, casting a faint circle of light to emphasize how dark the house had become. Maintained at a comfortable temperature of 68 degrees by the faithful furnace, it began to drop slowly and inevitably. You can't feel it yet, but you know it's happening. Heat is lost through insulating materials, which is good but not perfect. Through the window, this is a heat barrier, but not a heat eliminator. The fireplace becomes the center of your universe. You have always kept it clean and well maintained, more for creating an atmosphere than for a daily necessity, but now it has become your main means of keeping warm. You made a fire with the wood piled up in the garage last autumn. The flame gives people a feeling of survival rather than comfort. A warm circle extends about 6 feet from the stove. In addition, the house began to transition to a refrigerator. You move the necessities to the living room. Blankets, pillows, food that doesn't need to be cooked, and battery-powered radios become your only connection to the outside world. The radio sent out a shrill message intermittently. The road is closed and has affected hundreds of thousands of people. Emergency services are suspended. Stay indoors. Stay warm. Sustain life. Between the announcements, the still roars were like the small echoes of the wind outside. The afternoon vaguely transitioned into evening, without any trace of the usual passage of time. Without electric lights, houses would gradually unnaturally darken, just like the places where humans lived for thousands of years before Edison's invention. You had a cold dinner by candlelight. It wasn't romantic but necessary. You and your family gathered by the fireplace as night fell. When your youngest child asks you if you will die, the question hangs in the air like smoke. You comforted them with confidence that you didn't fully feel that way, explaining that people are always living in a snowstorm, houses are solid, you have food and water, and you had each other. Even if you say them out loud, these words will sound very empty because you can feel the cold approaching. It could be felt that the house had failed in the siege of the storm. The night brings a strange sense of isolation. The wind continued to rage, but in the darkness, the sound became even more ominous and hard to explain. Rhythmic tapping rhythmically. It could be a blinds or a door you forgot to close. The sound keeps going and becomes maddening. You ventured to the window and pressed your face against the cold glass, seeing nothing. There is only the chaos of black and white. The snow was not illuminated, and its pattern of movement seemed to be alive. You take turns to sleep, and there's always someone awake to watch over the fire, making sure the flames don't go out, leaving you vulnerable in the cold that hubs every wall. Although there were blankets and pillows, the floor was hardened, the sleep was intermittent, interrupted by explosive gusts of wind, by the child sobbing in restless dreams, and by the anxiety that emerged each time I woke up in the dark and cold. At the beginning of the second day, there was no horn and no usual morning ceremony. You woke up stiffly on the floor of the living room, feeling very uncomfortable. The fire has burned to ashes and needs to be dealt with immediately. Outside, the grey light reveals a completely transformed world. Snowflakes bury everything familiar. A strange landscape of white hills and valleys has been created in your front yard. This house is really cold now. So cold that I can see my own breathing. The water left in a glass overnight as a thin layer of ice skin. You fold your clothes and all your things and make insulating materials with cotton, woolens, and synthetic fibers. Your children look like little bunches wrapped in cloth, with their faces peeping out of the cocoons of coats, scarves and blankets that are draped like cloaks. Breakfast consists of cookies and peanut butter. You don't have much enthusiasm when eating them, but you should understand that your body needs fuel to generate heat. The refrigerator has turned into an expensive cabinet. Without electricity, the food inside was just a cold storage, although the entire house is now a cold storage. You move the perishable things outside and bury them in the snow, where they will freeze solid, and there the storm itself becomes your preservation system. Radio coverage is deteriorating. The storm has ceased and remained motionless over the Midwest, deciding to clear itself completely before moving forward. In some areas, the snowfall exceeds twice per hour. The wind speed reached 70 miles per hour. The National Guard has been activated, but is unable to move because all their vehicles have been defeated by the snow. Lunch does not refresh. The world has stopped functioning. They have become a group of isolated people, waiting for nature to dry up. You try to kill time by reading, but when you are cold and worried, constantly listening to the changing tones of the wind, you can't concentrate. Your spouse suggested that you play card games. You played a few rounds before everyone lost interest, before pretending to be normal became too tired to maintain. Children quarrel for no reason. This kind of special quarrel occurs when people are confined to a small space for too long. The temperature in the room continued to drop. It's very faithful. It can only heat one room and the heating is not even. It's very hot near the flame and very cold near the wall. You are now wearing gloves indoors. Even when sitting by the stove, you have given up keeping your feet warm. Most of the time they are numb. No matter how many wool socks there are, they can never solve that deep cold pain. You boldly walk to the front door, thinking that you might carve out a path and regain control of your environment. The door won't open. Snow is drifting up and down on it. A white wall was built to block your exit. But the result was still the same. You are not trapped by a lock, but by nature, frozen by the water that has turned your home into a prison. The windows offer no comfort, only variations of the same view. The white chaos, the movement without progress. The amount of snow falling and blowing seems impossible. In some places carved by the wind, the drifting objects have already reached the windows on the second floor. Your car is missing. It has become part of the scenery, another snow-covered mound, and distinct from everything else. The third day turned into the second day, with no difference in any sense. It is not measured in hours but in burning wood, consumed candles, and the slow climb from unease to despair. The fire has never stopped. Feeding it has become the central ritual of survival, and all other tasks revolve around it. You are now rationing water, even though you have a lot of water buried in the snow. The effort required to melt snow for drinking teaches you efficiency. Apart from survival, you can't waste fuel heating water to wash clothes. You have the smell of smoke and an unwashed humanity, But everyone is like this. The old factory miner-style offensive has become another component of the new normal. The radio continued to report on the crisis in great detail. The death toll keeps rising. Hospitals are overwhelmed. People die of heart disease caused by shoveling snow, of low body temperature at home, and of carbon monoxide from desperate attempts to keep warm. Every tragedy is announced in the same restrained tone, as if normalizing terror through presentation. You eventually turned it off because you couldn't bear others' disasters while you were living in your own. Your child has become surprisingly quiet, moving beyond the stage of complaining and entering a state of resigned patience. They spend most of their time sleeping, wrapped under each of your blankets to save energy. You look at them, feeling a complex mixture of protection and helplessness. You can keep them away from the storm, but you can't make them comfortable. It's impossible to restore the world to what it was 4 days ago. A subtle change occurred on the 4th day. The wind began to weaken. It kept roaring, weakening to a sound less apocalyptic. The snow is still falling, but the speed has slowed down, as if the blizzard has finally exhausted its ammunition. It's too early to hope. You've learned it. But in any case, you can sense that the last bit of optimism. Perhaps this ordeal is about to come to an end. You manage to use a combination of strength and shovel work to open the back door and step into an unrecognizable world. At the shallowest point above your head, the snow has accumulated up to your chest. Its efforts immediately wear people out. Each step requires you to lift your legs completely out of the snow, then lean forward and repeat. 20 feet will leave you out of breath and sweating profusely in the bitter cold. The sky was still overcast and gloomy, but somehow it brightened. Grey is less oppressive and implies the possibility of cleaning up. You can see further now, perhaps 100 yards instead of 10 yards. What you see is a pure white landscape, occasionally interspersed with black shapes. Houses, trees, and utility poles were all patiently buried by the snow and transformed into abstract forms. I can't see anyone else. Apart from the snow still falling, the wind was still reorganizing the accumulated snow, making no sound at all. Your community has turned into a ghost town. Everyone was quarantined at home. Everyone is struggling with cold, boredom, and growing anxiety. You want to know who else is looking out, who else is seeing this strange new world, and when the old world will return. You dug a path to the propane tank because you were worried that the propane was running out and your only source of cooking fuel might be exhausted. This job is very cruel. Some layers of snow are thick and wet, while others are light and powdery. Moving it requires you to forget the muscles you have. Every few minutes you would stop panting, your heart beating fast and your back screaming in protest. It shows as half full. It's enough for you to use for another week. If you're more careful, you might be able to use it for another week. Back indoors you were soaked through with sweat, and the transition from hot exercise to cold inactivity brought about intense shivering. You change into dry clothes, pick out the precious ones from your dwindling collection, and curl up by the stove until your body temperature stabilizes. Your efforts have paid off. Even though you wore gloves, your hands still had skin. Even though you were wrapped in a scarf, your face was still burning hot from the wind. Despite the need to save, your energy is still exhausted. At the beginning of the 5th day, a miraculous scene emerged. The blue sky seen through the breaking clouds. The real sunlight shone on the snow, turning it into a diamond. This kind of beauty is almost painful in its intensity. This suddenly reminds us that the world is not merely grey and white, not merely wind and cold. You stand by the window, your eyes brimming with tears, but you can't tell whether it's relief, exhaustion, or simply an overburdened sensory experience. Radio reports say that the worst is over, the storm has finally passed, and recovery work has begun, although it will take days or weeks. The road remains impossible. It will take time to restore power supply, but the active state of emergency has ended. You survived. You all survived. Although the victory seemed empty compared to the fatigue and discomfort of the past 5 days, the neighbors were like creatures waking up from hibernation. Dark figures moved slowly in the chestnut snow, checking each other and sharing any remaining resources. Someone was holding a chainsaw and began to clear the fallen trees. Some people have camping stoves and hot coffee is also provided. It miraculously returned to normal in the cup. You gather in groups of 3 or 5, stomp your feet, compare your experiences, and then find that your suffering is universal. Everyone is frozen. Each person has a limited supply. Everyone wonders if modern civilization is just a temporary illusion. The excavation work has officially begun. After ways, sidewalks, and paths between houses, despite considering the depth and weight of the snow, this task seems impossible to complete. You work until your muscles scream, then rest, and then work again. Slowly, gradually, order began to emerge from the chaos. Where there is no path, for those who are determined enough to take risks, streets are almost impossible to exist. Power was restored on the 6th day, but not in all areas. It was only partially restored. Workers are currently repairing the damage. When your lamp flickered on, when the stoves coughed out life and began its familiar song, you could hardly believe it. Heat is flowing out of the vent, a forced air blessing that you took for granted before this week. The reading of the thermostat is 47 degrees. You have been living in a walk minus and freezer all along without realizing how cold it has become. The refrigerator hummed and was put back into use. The TV was vividly broadcasting the disastrous scenes of the entire area. Once the pipe falls water freely from the faucet. Every convenience restored is like a small miracle, a gift that you haven't fully appreciated before it is taken away. You stood in the hot bath until the water tank cooled down, washing away the smoke, fear and forced perseverance of 6 days. Life won't return to normal immediately. The school remains closed. It is difficult for enterprises to reopen. The supply chain was disrupted for several weeks. But the acute phase has ended. Survival mode has given way to recovery mode. You eventually return to work, driving on streets that have hardly been cleaned up, passing houses still buried underground, and cars that won't be restored until spring. The storm left its mark on everything. Physical damage is true, but there are also things that are difficult to quantify. You find that you have changed in small aspects. I'm even more grateful to the heat and light. Become more aware of the vulnerability of infrastructure. Show more respect for the power of winter. You have already seen what happens when the thin coat of modernity is stripped away. When human beings are left with only the most basic needs: warmth, food, water and shelter. This experience has always made me feel humble, and for a long time after the snow melted, this feeling still lingered. A few months later, it will still remember those days. The sound of the wind blowing against the window, the desperate distribution of firewood, and the fear flashing in your spouse's eyes where you think the children are not looking at you. This storm has become a landmark, a dividing line before and after, and a shared trauma that binds all those who have experienced it together. Now when people mention winter, your mind immediately goes back to January 1978, that week when heavy snow blocked the world and cold became the only reality. You know that comfort is temporary, and a sense of security is an illusion maintained by complex systems. Nature doesn't care about your schedule, your plans, or the thoughts you think are invincible. This lesson makes you more anxious and also more resilient. Anxiety is because you know that things will soon fall apart, because you know you can get through it. This storm taught you to interpret the sky in a different way, made you take warnings seriously, and maintained what you previously thought was a paranoid supply. You have become someone who compulsively checks the weather in winter, someone who prepares extra batteries and candles, and someone who never lets the fuel in your car's tank drop below half. This experience has been written into your behavior, changing you until the memory fades away. But there are also some other things, a strange nostalgia for those days, no matter how hard they were. Do you still remember the family gathering by the fireplace, united because of necessity, without any distractions? You remember the silence after the wind stopped, the deep tranquility of that world without motors, without electricity, and without any human voice except for breathing and heartbeat. Do you still remember how your neighbors united afterwards and how people helped each other without hesitation? This storm was terrifying, yes, but it also clarified the issue, revealing what was important and what was not. You under the comfortable and soft disguise. You won't choose to repeat it, won't wish it to happen to anyone. But you won't completely regret its lesson either. It makes you insignificant, makes you succumb to uncontrollable forces. And somehow you growed all, with endurance you didn't know you had. The snow finally melted. Snow is always like this. Spring has come. Green has replaced brown, and the world has taken on a brand new look, as if that white week was just a dream, rather than the reality of life. But you still carry that memory, that coldness, that fierce wind, that helpless weight. Every winter, whenever it snows, it will show up firmly. Every time weather forecasters use words like historic and unprecedented, you are different now. This week has been marked in both visible and invisible ways. You have reached the limit that human beings can endure. I saw the fragile barrier between civilization and chaos. Knowledge sits quietly in your heart most of the time, but it is always there. It reminds us that the world is wilder than it seems. Nature still possesses a power that humans cannot tame. That winter, when it made its choice, it could still freeze everything. On January 25, 1978, in the darkness before dawn, in a small office building in Cleveland, Ohio, the young meteorologist Lane David sat there, hunched over, looking at charts and data streams. His shift began at midnight, a quiet time of weather change, when most of the time there were no witnesses. When the human world was asleep, storms formed in the dark ocean or on the open prairie. He is tracking a galaxy coming from the west, one in dozens. He will be the monitor this month. There was nothing special in the initial presentation. The pressure reading first caught his attention. It is not their absolute values, but the rate of change, that is, the rate at which the air pressure drops when the system enters the Great Lakes region. He rechecked his instrument to see if there was any calibration error, as these figures were inconsistent with what he had predicted in the morning. The intensification of this storm was faster than any model had predicted. It was composed of a combination of conditions that some equations failed to capture. David has been engaged in this job for 3 years, long enough to trust his instruments, but not long enough to trust his intuition when they conflict with standard procedures. The agreement is very clear. Issue warnings based on reliable data. Don't shout the wolf is coming. Maintain public credibility through moderate conservatism. But some aspects of this system made him feel uneasy. Some qualities in the data suggest that the escalation of the situation has exceeded the normal range. He called his supervisor at home, woke him up from his sleep and described everything he had seen. The air pressure has dropped to 959 meters bar. Such a reading is almost unprecedented on such a distant land. The wind speed was faster than predicted, and the moisture from the Gulf of Mexico collided with the Arctic air from Canada. These waves indicate that this is not just a winter storm, but one close to a perfect meteorological storm. His supervisor was in a daze but noticed the tension in David's voice and told him to issue a winter storm warning and upgrade it to a warning if the situation continued to deteriorate. His words were cautious and prudent, reflecting years of false alarms and the experience of public complacency. When people hear about a snowstorm, they think of inconvenience rather than disaster. They were trained to repeatedly issue warnings that proved to be exaggerated, and to give predictions of 6 inches instead of 12 inches. David issued a warning, carefully choosing his words, attempting to convey the urgency without causing panic. He described the expected snowfall, wind speed, travel dangers, and the standard language for all winter weather forecasts. But when he sent messages through wired services and wireless networks, he knew that these words were not enough. This language designed for typical storms fails to capture his predictions about what is coming. By 6 snow began to fall in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. At first it was gentle. That kind of snow which looked very beautiful under the street lamps made the morning world soft and clean. Commuters began their daily routine, scraping the windshields, heating the engines, and listening to radio reports of a major winter storm, but nothing disastrous. Schools start on time, enterprises operate normally, and the machines of daily life continue to run as usual. Throughout the morning, David was observing the deterioration of the data, the organization of the storm becoming more obvious, the wind speed rising, and the pressure continuing to drop at an unprecedented rate. By 9 o'clock, he had upgraded all the warnings to the highest level and had been on the phone with the emergency management coordinator, doing his best to convey the danger information. But communication is only half of this equation. Reception is the other half. Most people are already at work and have started their plans for the day. The intensity of the storm accelerated around 10 as if a feedback loop had discovered its own power. The snow that was originally half an inch per hour into 3 inches per hour, and the wind speed that was originally just a nuisance reached a truly dangerous speed. Visibility dropped from extremely low to almost zero. Suddenly, the outside world turned into a blank white, and familiar landmarks vanished into the curtains of the wind-blown snow. The road is filled up faster than the plow clears. The highway department almost immediately realized that this was a lost battle. The snowplow got stuck by itself. Their immense weight and strength are insufficient to counter the accumulation speed they were designed to withstand. One by one, the counties in the disaster-stricken areas decided to hand over their equipment to the storm instead of having the operators risk their lives in increasingly futile efforts. The first distress call began to arrive at the emergency dispatch center around 11 o'clock. Drivers are trapped, and people are trapped in vehicles that seemed sufficient an hour ago, but now they have turned into frozen prisons. The dispatcher obtained information, promised unattainable assistance, advised people to stay in the car, save the engine and avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. This suggestion is reasonable, but it is also an admission of helplessness. You were alone until the emergency center couldn't find you. Earlier in the afternoon, state police attempted to carry out rescue operations. Mounted police officers drive for miners would doctor vehicles into increasingly impossible environments. They managed to find some trapped drivers. The car was crowded with trembling people. They made many round trips until their vehicle could no longer move. A mounted police officer in Indiana later described the moment when he realized he had to stop. He realized that the heavy snow couldn't even withstand the specially made emergency vehicles, and that continuing meant being part of the problem rather than the solution. Governors declared states of emergency one after another throughout the afternoon. Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin. Each statement carries the same information. Stay at home. Stay away from the road. Wait for the situation to improve. The National Guard was activated and mobilized to assist in rescue operations and snow removal. Although the deployment was immediately hindered by the same conditions that affected others. Military vehicles are more capable than civilian ones, but they are not magic. Deep enough snow stopped everything. In Detroit, a nurse named Patricia made a decision that later earned her both praise and criticism. Her duty time at the hospital was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but the storm made it impossible for her to go out and the patients also needed care. She called her husband and told him that she was going to stay. She couldn't give up her responsibility, even though she really wanted to go home. Her left and right. Other staff members also made similar calculations, choosing between duties and family, professional obligations and personal safety. The hospital has become an isolated island, cutting off the supply chain and normal personnel rotation. The remaining staff members shared the burden, working in 2 or 3 shifts. When they were exhausted, they would sleep in empty wards. They carefully rationed supplies because they knew that the delivery trucks couldn't arrive, and the insulin, medicine and sterile equipment they had on hand had to be maintained until the storm ended. Every decision carries weight that it wouldn't have under normal circumstances. Each calculation contains variables that should not exist in modern healthcare. In the countryside of Indiana, on Interstate 16, a truck driver named Thomas was sitting in his cab, with the engine on and the fuel gauge slowly dropping, almost empty. He was lost in thought about his decision to bring him here. He had known about the storm warning long ago, but he had to meet the deadline and deliver the goods. If he delayed the route, he would not be able to pay the bill. 8 hours ago, when the snow was light and the road was just smooth rather than impossible, this confidence seemed reasonable. Now he can't see more than 10 feet beyond the windshield. He hasn't seen any other vehicles for several hours. Occasionally, the truck shakes in strong winds, which can cause it to tilt. Snow accumulated around the wheels, and he could feel it even through the vehicle's suspension. He has food, water, blankets, and the basic survival equipment that an experienced driver must have. But the problem is fuel, a single resource that he cannot produce or allocate indefinitely. Thomas was doing calculations in his mind, brutally counting the number of warm hours and stormy hours. If he keeps starting the engine, he might run out of fuel within 10 hours, and if he's lucky, within 12 hours. If he runs intermittently, allowing the taxi to cool between cycles, he can extend it to 24 hours. The question is whether 24 hours is enough, whether the storm will end before its fuel runs out, and whether it will be discovered before the cold becomes permanent. He is not the only one who thinks so. Throughout the central and western regions, hundreds of people are conducting similar mathematical calculations, measuring fuel by time and temperature by duration. Some people will take a chance to win and preserve resources perfectly until rescue arrives. Some others will make miscalculations, running the engine for too long or not long enough, and later find out that they have a low body temperature or carbon monoxide poisoning. It's randomness, that is. Survival depends on both luck and the way of preparation, will trouble investigators in the future statistics and reconstruction of the timeline. Back at the National Weather Service, David watched as his prediction achieved a level of accuracy he had not intended to reach. This storm even exceeded his revised prediction and has become a subject of reference in meteorological textbooks for decades. The air pressure has dropped to its lowest point of 955 meters bar. This reading belongs to a hurricane, not a winter storm. In exposed areas, gusts approach 80 miles per hour, and even if the snowfall completely stops, ground blizzards will persist. He answered calls from emergency managers, government officials and radio stations, which were in urgent need of broadcasting information to isolated listeners. Every conversation is a variation of the same topic. How long will this situation last? When can we resume operations? What should we tell people? The data provided by David was that he carefully used the uncertainty of the weather to hedge his predictions. But the fact is that this storm has entered an area where historical precedents cannot provide guidance. The heavy snowfall lasted from the night of January 25th to January 26th without any pause. Even in the severe winter snowstorms, this kind of situation usually occurs. The system remains stagnant above the Great Lakes, relying on the temperature difference between the cold continental air and relatively warm lake water. It is now creating its own weather, sustaining itself through thermodynamic processes and turning the entire area into a snow-making machine. The accumulated weight of ice and snow on the transmission lines has caused the power grid to start malfunctioning. The utility company had anticipated the power outage and asked its staff to prepare for a rapid response in advance, but the scale exceeded their expectations. All the lines in the entire county have been cut off. The substation is buried underground and inaccessible. Even if they knew where the problem lay, the staff still couldn't reach the damaged area. The design of the power infrastructure is redundant and reinforced for typical winter conditions, making it simply unable to cope with attacks of this scale. In Columbus, Ohio, a power grid operator looked at his system diagram, with parts of the area darkening amid a chain of failures. Each faulty part increased the load on the rest of the power grid, forming a positive feedback loop, which eventually led to the complete collapse of the power grid. He made the difficult decision to implement rotational power outages and deliberately closed some areas to protect the entire system. This option will save the basic structure of the power grid, but on the coldest winter nights, thousands of people are still in the dark. The hospital has switched to power supply by generators. That familiar rumbling and vibration marked the transition from the power grid to the backup system. Most generators work as perfectly as designed, but some break down, are poorly maintained, or overburdened due to excessive demand. The hospital with a malfunctioning generator has become a crisis point within a greater crisis. Medical staff attempted to provide care with flashlights, trying to keep patients warm and safe without the electrical infrastructure assigned by modern medicine. A farmer named Robert in a rural area of Michigan opened his nails as night fell, turning the livestock facility into a refuge for humans. The barn was very cold, but much colder than a detached house that dissipated heat. Many people are safe. Resources. 20-3 people squeezed into the space of the cow wrapped in blankets and sleeping bags. Listening to the howling wind outside, the animals moved restlessly in the pen. Robert has a propane heater prepared for livestock. He uses it carefully. Even though it's very cold, he still opens the barn door to ventilate because he knows the danger of carbon monoxide in a closed space. The heat it provides is not high, almost insufficient to drive away the cold. But this is a small claim by humans against the overwhelming power of storms. People took turns to light fires, maintaining a vulnerable warmth and separating discomfort from real danger. The children in the barn adapted the fastest. Just as children often do, they played games in the straw, made friends with the cows and horses, and shared their refuge. For them, this was an adventure, an unexpected pajama party held in the strangest place. Adults looked at the children with envy and anxiety. They couldn't share the children's innocence and were too aware of how unstable their own situation was still. Telephone operators continue to work around the clock, answering calls when the lines are normal and leaving messages when they are interrupted. A Cleveland operator later estimated that she had handled over 1,000 calls during her shift. People visit their relatives, report emergencies, and look for unknown information. Every call is a small human drama. A voice crossed the distance shrouded by the storm, confirming that there was still one person. The world was not over yet, although it felt like it might have. The State Emergency Operations Center worked through the night, coordinating possible response measures. The map on their wall marked the affected areas in red, indicating road closures, power outages, and emergency reports. Red spread like an infectious disease at night, devouring the entire affected area until the map was almost useless. When everything is urgent, this classification loses its meaning. On January 26th, military helicopters attempted to carry out rescue operations, flying under conditions that pushed both the machines and the pilots to their limits. The helicopter capable of taking to the sky discovered the driver trapped on the highway and the houses where people were sending out distress signals. Rural areas are completely isolated from civilization. They did their best to land and rescue the most desperate patients, but fuel and weather limited their capabilities. A helicopter pilot, a National Guard pilot with combat experience, later described the rescue flight as more dangerous than anything he had experienced overseas. His ability is almost zero. The wind was fierce and unpredictable, and the snow blocked the air intake, threatening to freeze the rotor. They flew because someone was dying, but every flight was a carefully planned gamble, and the odds made the commanders uneasy. As time went by, the death toll began to rise, but with poor communication, accurate statistics were impossible and emergency services could not reach the reported number of casualties. Snow shoveling led to a heart attack, excessive heating caused carbon monoxide poisoning, hypothermia in trapped vehicles and collapsed houses, and traffic accidents on icy roads. Death descended on variety show, finding its weakness among the crowd tormented by the storm. David is still working in the Meteorological Service Department. He monitors the reports filtered from the entire region, and he feels powerless about the weight of the information. He did his job, issued warnings, provided forecasts, and maintained communication channels. But warnings couldn't stop the storm, and forecasts couldn't save lives when people were unable to take action. This sense of helplessness is unique to his profession. This stance is to see the disaster unfolding clearly but lack the ability to intervene. At dawn on January 26, the storm finally began to ease. After more than 30 hours of continuous attacks, its anger gradually waned. The snow was still falling, but its intensity had weakened. The wind that had been screaming began to quiet down and turned into a roar. This change was so gradual that people did not believe it at first and waited for the storm to strike again, because the ruthlessness of the previous day had made people accustomed to not expecting any mercy. The scenery presented by the faint morning light is almost incomprehensible in its changes. The streets turned into canyons between snow walls. The cars were buried so deep that only antennas or mirrors could hint at their presence. The buildings seemed to have shrunk, with their first floors vanishing under the snow that drifted to the windows on the second floor. The human geography of the entire region has been rewritten in white. Emergency services carry out their work conscientiously when conditions permit, although permission is a relative term. When the snow reached chest minus deepened, the strong wind continued to cause dangerous situations. The snowplow came out of the maintenance station and began a several minus-day mission to reopen the roads. Emergency vehicles followed the plowed road to check the drivers who were reported to be tracked. They found that some were still alive and grateful, while others remained silent in the cars and had turned into graves. The National Guard is deployed on tracked vehicles, which are the only ground vehicles capable of continuous movement in such deep snow. They established supply chains for hospitals with shortages of essential goods and provided shelters for displaced people without electricity or heating. Military precision brought order to the chaos, although military logistics were also tight within the scope of the disaster. Ackerman Center in Indianapolis coordinated the responses of multiple states, attempting to allocate scarce resources to the vast areas in need. Every decision is a triage. This town is before that town, this highway is before that highway, and these truck drivers are before those. This kind of calculation is cruel in terms of necessity, prioritizing more over less. The strategic route on an isolated cluster, but each choice depends on the person making the choice. Radio stations have become lifelines, constantly broadcasting road conditions, shelter locations, and emergency phone numbers. DJs give up their usual programs and instead read community information, tried to contact each other's families, offered help to people, and announced business closures. These radio stations can still continue broadcasting in the event of power failures and equipment malfunctions because they understand that they have become indispensable infrastructure, and their signals are sometimes the only connection to the broader world. In the days following the storm, through the aggregation of thousands of individual reports into terrifying statistics, the entire extent of the damage became clear. More than 100 people died in the affected states, although the exact number can never be determined. Some deaths were related to the storm, but not directly caused. Heart attacks and accidents can occur in any case, but due to the limitations or complexity of conditions. Hundreds more people were injured, leaving permanent marks. The accumulation rate of health complications and economic losses caused by trauma exposure from frostbite amputation accidents is even faster than that of human losses. Every business that goes bankrupt is a loss of revenue. Every time there is a delay in shipment, business is interrupted. Every worker who fails to complete the work loses productivity. The factories that power the economy of the Midwests it quietly. Their assembly line was halted not voluntarily but because it was impossible. Later on, the losses in the automotive industry alone will amount to hundreds of millions of dollars, although the real figure including tax may exceed $1 billion. With the trucks unable to move, the grocery stores that had already been snapped up were unable to replenish their inventories. The efficiency of the food supply chain is usually invisible, but due to the empty shelves, it has become a topic of anxiety and concern for people. Those who had 3 days worth of food found that 3 days were not enough and the storm lasted longer than expected. Neighbors share what they have. This is an informal redistribution network based on trust and need. The psychological impact is more difficult to quantify, but it is equally real. This storm shows that what people consider robust systems to be fragile and that civilization is just a thin layer covering the tails of nature. This revelation gave rise to different reactions. Some people have become more focused on disaster preparedness, storing food and supplies to deal with future disasters. Others are anxious about the winter weather and hold back from what used to seem like routine snowfall forecasts. David will continue his career as a meteorologist, but January 1978 will still be his reference point, which is the measure for all other storms. He will write an academic paper on this dynamics, will teach the importance of positive early warning protocols, and will debate for better modeling systems to predict the next one. But he will also remember to watch the disaster happening in real time, knowing what is about to happen but unable to stop it. The Great Snowstorm of 1978 will enter collective memory as one of the generational markers dividing time into before and after. People will refer to it for decades. Do you still remember 1978? They would say that every person of a certain age would not. They would have their own stories about where they had been, how they had survived, and what they had lost. This storm turned into public property, a shared trauma that bound together those who had experienced it. The insurance company will spend several months processing claims, calculating the damage to property and vehicles, and attempting to quantify the losses caused by the storm in terms of money. The figures they obtained seem both huge and insufficient. How do you evaluate a week of fear? Enduring the cold and wavering beliefs. The checks they write can restore property, but not confidence. Rebuild the buildings, but not the sense of security before the storm. It will take months for the damaged infrastructure to be fully repaired. The power cord must be reconnected. In addition to simple snow removal, roads also require a lot of maintenance. Buildings damaged by ice and wind need structural work. Maintenance workers provided employment opportunities during the economically stagnant winter, which was an unexpected stimulus that partially offset the destructive economic impact of the storm. But this work is arduous, cold and dangerous, repairing what nature has destroyed in this rough under uncomfortable conditions. Meteorological analysis began almost immediately. Scientists are eager to understand what caused such a special event. They study air pressure readings, wind direction, temperature distribution, and all the data that described storms in numbers and charts. What they discovered was a nearly perfect conditional confluence, with Arctic air, bay humidity, enhanced Great Lakes, and atmospheric dynamics amplifying rather than suppressing this system. Analysis confirms that the composition of storms can be predicted, but their combinations and intensities are unprecedented. Each factor exists independently in meteorological records, but the possibility of their simultaneous occurrence is statistically so small that no model gives them appropriate weighting. It reminds us that nature operates in a space guided by probability theory, but with uncertainty, where the impossible will eventually become inevitable over sufficient time. In the coming years, academic conferences will feature sessions dedicated to snowstorms, presenting highly titled technical terminology papers. That behind the scientific language lies a simpler question that drives research. Can we prevent this situation? The answer is no. It is honest. We can't stop the weather, we can only be well-minus prepared. The snowstorm has prompted people to make improvements in forecasting, emergency response, building codes and infrastructure design. But it also confirms the limitations that technology cannot surpass. The story that emerged during the storm has become a local folktale. Stories are told and retold through the embellishment and compression of memory. Some stories are heroic. The nurse walked 5 miles in the snow to reach the hospital. The snowblower operator who worked continuously for 40 hours. This family placed 12 neighbors in the basement. The other stories are tragedies. The elderly couple were found frozen at home. That truck driver who runs out of fuel. That child walked out of their house and vanished into the white world. For those who experienced that snowstorm, the one in 1978 is still vivid in their minds. In other ways that memories fade away. They remember the specific details, the sound of the wind, the quality of the cold, and the snow reflected on the street lamps on their windows. They remember the decisions made under pressure, the choices made among bad ones, and the moments when fate smiles or turns around. Their memories are different, but they share a common thread: fear, patience, and that strange sense of clarity when facing the forces of nature. The government's response to the storm was initially praised for its mobilization and coordination, but as more and more information about delayed decision-making and insufficient preparation emerged, the government's response was criticized. Some people believe that the warning should be stronger, states should close roads earlier, and the National Guard should be activated earlier. When the severity of the storm is known and the consequences are visible, post-event criticism becomes much easier, but it prompts a genuine review of procedures and protocols. Congressional hearings review the federal government's response, the distribution of disaster relief supplies, and the coordination between state and federal agencies. These hearings produced legislation, a bill aimed at improving the emergency management system and disaster relief financing mechanism. The impact of the storm extended to policies, changing the way governments at all levels prepare for and respond to weather emergencies. The economic recovery takes longer than the physical recovery, lasting from winter to spring, as enterprises strive to make up for their losses. Some small businesses with already meager profits will never recover. For enterprises that cannot afford disruptions, a loss of revenue within 1 or 2 weeks is fatal. These failures spread throughout the community. Every business that goes bankrupt not only loses its business, but also its jobs, its gathering place, and its community infrastructure. The agricultural impact will not be fully understood until the spring sowing season. At that time, farmers will find that their livestock have been lost due to the cold. The weight of ice and snow will damage equipment, and the structure of barns and factories will also malfunction. The death toll of cattle, pigs and chickens has reached several thousand. Every lost animal represents unattainable income and products that cannot enter the market. Federal agricultural disaster assistance is helpful, but it cannot fully compensate for the losses. The winter of 1978 became a benchmark in the history of the region and a symbol for measuring the winters that followed. When people describe snowfall or cold, they say not since 1978 and take blizzard as the ultimate criterion for the severity of winter. This comparison is almost comforting. It is a way to link smaller difficulties with the greatest ones. For meteorologists, this snowstorm remains a case study of forecast uncertainty and communication challenges. They realized that they had correctly identified the threat, but it was difficult to convey its severity to the public who were not sensitive to regular winter weather alerts. It is still very difficult to strike a balance between accuracy and alarm. How do you make people understand that this time is different? The storm exceeded all typical parameters, yet it did not become a forecaster shouting "the wolf is coming." Decades later, David will retire from the National Weather Service. Throughout his career, he has tracked countless storms and traversed technological revolutions in the field of prediction. But when asked what the most unforgettable day of his work was, he would go back to January 25, 1978, that night when he witnessed a storm that even exceeded his worst prediction. Keep the memory clear. Pressure readings, phone calls, more and more people are realizing that some historically significant things are happening. The snowstorm in 1978 taught us how to be well-prepared, how to enhance the resilience of infrastructure, and how to pay attention to the importance of early warnings, even when they are common. But perhaps its most profound lesson is simpler and older. The power of nature is beyond human control. That kind of weather is out of place with civilization. That winter, if it wished, could still simplify the modern world to the most primitive necessities. This snowstorm was a reminder written in ice and snow, still clearly distinguishable decades later. We will never be as safe as we believe, nor will we be as isolated from the natural world as our technology shows. Those who survived endured this knowledge in silence. A personal understanding emerges every winter when it begins to snow. They check the weather forecast more carefully, prepare more thoroughly, and respect the potential of winter more profoundly than those who only know the story. The snowstorm left them with indelible marks of time. They are survivors of something that tests civilization and discovers its shortcomings. After witnessing a week, the modern world came to a halt and winter completely took over the world. The heavy snowstorm in 1978, like all storms, began thousands of feet above the ground. In that cold place before the weather arrived and brought trouble to humanity, the invisible movement of the air. The science of storms is the science of boundaries, about what happens when air masses from different places meet and interact. In late January 1978, such masses approached each other over the Midwestern United States, and their geometry was later proved to be catastrophic. The Arctic air from the north comes from the polar regions, where winters are absolute. The cold not only makes people uncomfortable but is also fatal. This air mass is dense and heavy, carrying coldness and sinking towards the Earth's surface, just like water seeking its horizontal plane. Its temperature on the ground is negative, below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, numbing exposed flesh and freezing breathing in the lungs within minutes. The moisture coming from the south is from the Gulf of Mexico. This warm water body can transfer heat and humidity to the atmosphere even in winter. This tropical air has a lower density and a higher temperature. Water vapor evaporates from the surface of the Gulf of Mexico and is blown northward by prevailing winds. Under normal circumstances, these air masses meet along the front from weather and then dissipate as conditions change. But the geometry in 1978 was not normal at all. The collision occurred directly above the Great Lakes, and these huge inland seas represent the meteorological factors of the regional weather. Although it is very cold in January, these lakes have not yet frozen, and the water temperature remains at 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. By human standards it is cold, but it is warm compared to the air above. They are ready to provide food for the storm and water and energy for a system that will utilize both with devastating efficiency. Meteorologists have a term for what happens next: explosive cyclone effect, which is the rapid intensification of a low and pressure system and turns regular weather into a catastrophic event. This process involves thermodynamics, fluid dynamics and atmospheric physics, and is too complex to be simply explained. But in essence, it is feedback. The conditions under which a storm is generated will intensify the storm, and the storm will in turn generate stronger conditions in a cycle until a limiting factor intervenes. The pressure at the center of the storm dropped at an astonishing rate, from values associated with typical winter weather to those typically seen only in major hurricanes. This pressure drop indicates that air is being drawn upwards at the core of the storm, creating a void on the surface, which is quickly filled by the surrounding air. That rapid air is the wind. The greater the pressure difference, the faster the wind blows. The result of the Earth's rotation. It determines all large scale atmospheric movements and organizes the incoming air into counterclockwise spirals. The storm transformed into a huge circular engine, drawing in air from all directions, rotating around its central axis, and then expelling it outward in the upper atmosphere. The entire system is several hundred miles wide and is a continental meteorological machine. When the air rotates inward and upward, it cools as the air pressure decreases with height. Cold air contains less moisture than warm air. Therefore, water vapor begins to condense, forming clouds and snowflakes, releasing the latent heat stored in the water vapor. The released heat further powers the system. The increased energy strengthens the circulation, generates more uplift, produces more precipitation and releases more heat. The amount of snowfall is not uniform, but varies throughout the storm system in response to changes in temperature, humidity and lift. Near the center of the strongest uplift, snowfall is measured in inches per hour. The rate of accumulation is so fast that the ground is buried faster than any human effort. In areas further from the center, there is less precipitation, but it covers a large area covering the entire state. The wind may be more important than the snow itself. It carves the precipitation that falls into snow, which has almost no relation to the actual amount of snowfall. In open areas, the wind blows the snow onto exposed ground and then piles it up in sheltered spots, where the snow can be as deep as 15 feet. 20 feet, or even 30 feet. The landscape has transformed into a study of fluid dynamics. Snow behaves like water, flowing around obstacles and gathering in lone, ice-lying areas. The ancients regarded storms as the expression of the will of the gods and weather as the language for communication between gods and humans. They are not completely wrong. At this scale, the weather has something transcendent, something that reduces human initiative to a negligible level. The traditions of the Indians and the Great Lakes region include a profound understanding of the winter mood and practical wisdom contained in interpreting the stories of clouds and wind. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Agichivians had been living in this area for centuries, and they had detailed terms for different types of winter weather. They distinguished between the gentle snow that accumulated slowly and the heavy snow that came with the cold wind. Their language contains words that describe the nature of snow, wet or dry, sticky or powdery, because these properties determine survival strategies, the possibility of travel, and the success of hunting. Traditional ecological knowledge emphasizes respecting the power of winter and understanding that humans cannot conquer the cold, but can only endure it through preparation and humility. These stories that have been passed down through generations contain warnings about reading weather signals, about respecting the signals provided by nature, the black stripes on bare caterpillars, the behavior of birds and mammals, the quality of autumn leaves, all of which are believed to predict the harsh winter. Modern science has largely abandoned this traditional knowledge, considering it superstition and relying on instruments and mathematical models instead. But such a dismissal might be too early. Recent studies have shown that some traditional weather forecasts have a genuine correlation with the actual situation. Animals do respond to changes in air pressure before a storm arrives. Plants do indeed adjust their behavior based on the long-stem climate signals that we have just begun to understand. The snowstorm in 1978 dwarfed modern predictions, although it verified some predictive principles. Meteorologists accurately predicted that a storm was approaching, accurately predicted the snow and wind, but failed to convey the scale of the upcoming storm. Part of the reason for the failure is technical. The model is unable to capture the rapid intensification of the storm, and it also has communication capabilities. There is a gap between understanding and effective early warning. After the storm, some people reported that their experience was close to the mysterious feeling of emerging in the wind and the feeling of communicating with the weather itself. These reports are regarded as stress responses, the psychological effects of long-term isolation and fear. But they suggest how humans perceive extreme situations and how rational thinking responds to forces beyond everyday experience. The sound of the blizzard in 1978 was as unforgettable as its visual impact. The continuous howling was interrupted by explosive gusts, causing buildings to shake and trees to bend. Some people describe the sound as breathing, as if the storm were a living thing, taking in and expelling air. Others compare it to machinery, jet engines or industrial equipment that exceeds design limits. The sound environment is very depressing. Less does not refresh, irritable, a sound wave attack that lasts for several days. There are some subtle changes in this sound, which careful listeners can distinguish. The howling of the wind over the power lines, the sound of snow hitting the windows, the creaking of buildings under pressure, and occasionally the cracking of branches. Soundscapes have become a source of information and anxiety. Every new sound needs an explanation. Every change in the tone of the wind hints at a possible disaster. The physics of sound under blizzard conditions has produced unusual sound phenomena. Snow absorbs sound waves, causing abnormal quietness in some cases, while wind spreads sound farther than usual in others. People reported that they heard sounds from a distance unusually clearly. The train is several miles away. No plows are clearing snow on the streets. Someone is crying for help from a distant place. The sound reversal caused by temperature gradients bends sound waves in unexpected ways. After the storm's silence returned, and the absence of wind itself became striking. People say that this silence is almost real, as if the air had frozen after a storm. The silence was only broken by the distant sounds of recovery, helicopters, snowplows and people calling out to each other on the changed land. The contrast between the ferocity of the storm and the calm after it is psychologically disturbing. The magic weapons of the blizzard were preserved in an unexpected way, and the frozen moment lasted until spring. Ford displayed them. The newspapers blown out of the delivery pipe were found to be completely readable and were sealed in ice to prevent them from rotting. A child's toy was left in the yard and was not found until several months later. Slightly damaged but recognizable. This is a time capsule before the storm. The cars abandoned on the highway have become archaeological sites. Their interiors preserve evidence of the moment when the occupants gave up reaching their destination. Food packaging, coffee cups, blankets and coats, as well as maps marked with tree roots, all of these were frozen in place before the rescue workers arrived. Each car tells a little story about the decision and situation at the moment when moving forward became impossible. The marks left by the buildings damaged by the storm have remained clearly visible for many years. Nettle bending, masonry cracking, roof deformation, and snow load exceeding the structural load minus bearing capacity. Some communities choose not to repair certain damages and use these buildings as storm monuments to remind people of the electricity in winter. The collapsed barn roof, the windows shattered by the storm, and the fence flattened by the snowdrifts. These became informal memorials. The hydrological characteristics of storms bear the marks of decades of research by scientists. The snow that fell in January 1978 represented a large amount of water temporarily stored in solid form. When spring comes, melting begins and the stored water is released within a few weeks, causing concerns about floods and replenishing the aquifer. The timing and geography of snowmelt affect agriculture. Groundwater levels and river flow throughout the growing season. Ice scores collected from the Great Lakes reveal the characteristics of this storm. This layer marks the week in January when temperatures dropped sharply and ice and snow accumulated on the surface. This layer contains atmospheric particles, chemical characteristics of pollution, and natural gas soil that captured air bubbles in January 1978. These ice scores have become historical documents, recording what the storm left behind in the ice. Meteorological observers noticed unusual elliptical phenomena during and after the storm. Light columns, halos, sound dogs and other refraction effects produced by ice crystals in the air. The atmosphere transformed into a prism, bending light into almost supernatural patterns. Photos from this period sometimes captured these effects, strange light and shapes, making the storm scene seem otherworldly. Disaster psychology science encompasses the study of how humans handle and remember catastrophic events, and how memories preserve and distort experiences. The survivors of the 1978 snowstorm have always had a clear memory of the specific details. The color of the light in the snowstorm, the texture of the snow blown by the wind on the skin, and the special coldness that penetrates layer upon layer of clothes. These sensory memories persist with extraordinary clarity and are imprinted in consciousness due to their intensity. Memory researchers point out that traumatic or major events can produce what they call flash memory. Memories that feel as accurate as photons have remained stable for decades. The snowstorm created such memories throughout the region. Shared experiences have become part of the collective identity. When survivors meet and discover that they have experienced it before, this connection is direct and profound. But memory is also reconstructed and influenced by later experiences and narratives. The stories people tell about storms have undergone subtle changes over time, emphasizing different details and reorganizing events into a more coherent narrative than what experience offers. That gap between the reality of life and the stories and memory is where history turns into folk tales and where facts transform into meanings. This storm has raised some philosophical questions: the relationship between humans and nature, the limits of technological civilization, and what will happen when the natural world refuses to adapt to human timetables and expectations. These questions have been asked before. Every generation is confronted with weather that reminds them of their vulnerability. But the snowstorm in 1978 had a particular impact on a society that believed nature was basically managed and controlled. The environmental movement in the 1970s had already begun to question the assumption that humans dominate nature. But the snowstorm provided heartfelt evidence for these arguments. Nature here demonstrates a power that surpasses human relief. The weather doesn't care about the economic system or the political structure. This lesson is outdated. As the saying goes, nature is lasting. But every generation must relearn. The indigenous knowledge system, which had never given up respect for the forces of nature, suddenly found itself related to conversations that had previously dismissed them. The idea that weather may not only require prediction, but also relationships. Not only modeling but also humility is drawn attention in discussions about climate and civilization. This snowstorm has become an argument for combining traditional wisdom with modern science. This storm also demonstrated the vulnerability of complex systems and how the interdependence that creates efficiency under normal conditions becomes fragile under pressure. The power grid, road network, supply chain and communication infrastructure all partially or completely failed because they were optimized for typical cases rather than extreme ones. Engineers have realized that flexibility requires different design concepts rather than efficiency. For decades since 1978, climate science has provided the backdrop for the extreme weather of that winter. Although no event can be entirely attributed to climate change, research shows that the atmospheric conditions capable of generating such storms may be influenced by larger climate patterns. The location of the jet stream, Arctic temperature, ocean heat content, and all the factors that cause storms may all be influenced by long-term climate trends. The question is no longer whether the 1978 snowstorm was caused by climate change. It predates most major anthropogenic warming. However, as the climate continues to change, will the possibility of storms of similar intensity occurring in the future increase or decrease? Science offers a complex answer as winter events may become increasingly rare, while others may intensify due to increased atmospheric humidity and changes in circulation patterns. This storm has left a great deal of legacy in scientific literature. Hundreds of papers have analyzed its dynamics, its impact, and the lessons it offers for prediction and emergency response. This event became a benchmark, a test case for verifying the model and measurement process. When new forecasting technologies are developed, they will be traced back to 1978 to see if they can better predict the behavior of storms. But beyond scientific papers and technical analyses, this snowstorm remains a mysterious story about how the weather turned out, and despite having so many instruments and equations, it still retains elements of unpredictability and awe. This storm was only explained afterwards. Its driving force was understood and recorded, but at the moment it occurred, it was a completely incomprehensible force, a natural phenomenon that humans could not comprehend. The behavior of the snowflakes almost turned into liquid, flowing around the obstacles and gathering in the depressions, forming shapes that seemed to be consciously carved out. The wind carves the landscape into art, with ridges and curves, peaks and valleys, abstract forms of white to white, briefly existing before the next gust reshapes them. This kind of beauty is cold and strange, possessing the charm often found in dangerous things. In the silence after the storm, before human activities resumed, the world experienced a primitive silence that might no longer exist and might have been wiped out by the ubiquitous background noise of modern civilization. Those who walked directly into the disaster site said that it was like entering another world where ordinary rules were set aside and reality was rewritten by snow. The mystery does not lie in what happened. Meteorology can explain this, but in its sense, it reveals the relationship between human civilization and the natural system in which it exists. This storm left a deep impression on the entire region beneath the surface of civilization. The world remains wild, and winter still knows how to halt human plans and impose its own rhythm. Right, that vast expanse of white, that stillness. That week, the world came to a halt, and winter made a sound that needed to be heard. Science explains the mechanism, but not the meaning. The reason was described, but its significance was not. Some mysteries remain after being explained, preserved between how and why. On January 26, 1978, in the administrative office of the Detroit Motor Company, men in suits and ties gathered around the conference table, looking through the high windows at the heavy snow covering a city that had ceased to function. Looking from the 40th floor, the landscape has become abstract, and the familiar geography has been erased under the white. These people are accustomed to controlling resources, managing production systems that employ hundreds of thousands of people, and transferring metals and currencies in large quantities, thereby shaping regional economies. But this storm exposed something they were reluctant to admit. That power is backed by background and relies on the design functions of the system. Without electricity to run assembly lines, without roads to transport parts and products, and without workers to reach factories, industrial machines would come to a halt. Billions of dollars worth of infrastructure are left idle, as useless as monuments, while snow is piling up and the wind is howling. Economic calculations immediately began, as is often done in board meetings with decisions quantified into quarterly reports and shareholder value. For every hour production stops, income decreases. Market share may be ceded to competitors, and the promises made to distributors and customers cannot be fulfilled. The pressure to resume operations is huge, which is reflected in contracts, financial forecasts, and executive compensation, linked to productivity indicators. But Storm refused to negotiate. You can't bargain with their pressure, nor can you offer encouragement to the wind. The forces that shut down factories were indifferent to economic disputes, to the impact on regional employment, and to the series of consequences brought about by production halts. Nature operates according to time scales and priorities, regardless of fiscal quarters or production plans. This contradiction is acute. The efficiency that makes the automotive industry profitable under normal circumstances becomes fragile in special circumstances. A just minus and minus time inventory system means the least parts inventory, which means that even a brief supply chain disruption will have an immediate impact. The optimization of typical conditions leads to brittleness under atypical conditions. In a financial district of Chicago, the usually bustling trading floor has become surprisingly quiet as traders cannot reach their posts. In an open market, trading volume has decreased, and uncertainty has affected pricings. Information flow has become fragmented. Agricultural futures contracts showed volatility as traders tried to calculate how much winter wheat was destroyed by snow, how many cattle died in uneaten barns, and the impact of equipment damage on spring planting. The economic losses caused by this storm are difficult to calculate in real time, but they are clearly astronomical figures. When there is no job, wages will be in arrears, which means that spending will decline. This implies that the economy based on the assumption of continuous circulation will have a chain reaction. Facts have proved that money needs movement to function. Frozen in place, it is as useless as water frozen in a pipe. With each report of property damage, vehicle detention, and business disruption claims, the risk exposure of insurance companies is increasing. Actuarial tables that can usually predict losses with reasonable accuracy did not classify such severe weather events in the region. This storm is rewriting risk models, forcing enterprises to reconsider their assumptions about what might happen to the winter climate in the Midwest. Meanwhile, in ordinary households, heat comes from radiators or footballs. Food is purchased daily rather than stored. Missing out on work means missing out on rent, and the economic impact of the storm is more direct and personal. The difference between discomfort and disaster is not measured in millions, but in a few dollars wage gap, which distinguishes abundance from scarcity. The elites weathered this storm from the isolated status that money and preparation could offer. Their home has a backup generator that starts up when the power grid goes out, maintaining heating and lighting while the neighbors are shivering in the dark. They stocked up on the food they had bought before the storm, which was enough for them to get through a week or two safely. They have sufficient resources to view storms as inconveniences rather than disasters. But insulation is not invincible. Even the rich have discovered that the things money can buy to protect against the weather are limited. Their generator needs fuel, but when the roads are impassable, the fuel cannot be transported. Their larger house requires more heating, but the backup system cannot provide it. Their authoritative position makes it impossible for them to order the snow to melt or the wind to stop. Government officials face the storm from their own complex positions, but have limited capabilities. Governors declared a state of emergency and mobilized the National Guard to perform the leadership ceremonies required by their positions. However, although the authorities have announced that rescue efforts depend on actual capabilities rather than political authority, these statements have hardly changed in the areas where people are trapped. Meetings held in state and county governments have a performance-like nature. Officials coordinate response measures until the situation improves before they can be truly implemented. They issued a warning, telling people to stay at home, avoid traveling, and wait for assistance. Wise advice, but essentially passive. Acknowledge that the government's positive power was suspended due to the storm. It forms a sharp contrast with the experiences of ordinary citizens. Officials were holding a meeting in a government building heated by a backup power source. They were coordinating through the still operating telephone lines of the emergency system, while the people they managed were crowded around the fireplace, worried about running out of fuel. The gap between the ruled is usually abstracted by bureaucracy and distance, but this storm has made it concrete and geographical. The federal government's response was slow, not only hindered by the same conditions that affected everyone else, but also by political considerations regarding costs and precedents. The president was briefed on the situation, received reports from the federal emergency management agencies, and faced the frequently asked question in disaster statements how much money the federal government should allocate to address this fundamentally regional crisis. The decision was made in the Washington office, far from the disaster-stricken area, where the storm was an abstract concept that could be seen through data and reports rather than experienced personally. The officials making decisions are enthusiastic and safe. Apart from additional meetings and briefings, their daily work remains unchanged. They understand this crisis rationally, but not from the bottom of their hearts. Knowing these numbers but not knowing the feeling of watching one's own breath freeze at home. When the federal disaster statement was finally issued, they brought in emergency funds and resources. However, the timing of aid is determined by bureaucratic procedures rather than human needs. The form must be filed. The loss must be evaluated. Procedures must be followed. The government aid mechanism aimed at preventing fraud and ensuring accountability operates so fast that people waiting for aid feel extremely slow. Economic elites, business executives, major investors and major property owners weathered the storm mainly through financial shocks rather than physical difficulties. Their quarterly earnings will show losses. Their stock portfolio will reflect the uncertainty of the market. Their real estate investments may face insurance claims, but they themselves are largely unaffected by the cold and hunger of the poor. The CEO of a manufacturing company spent a stormy week in his suburban mansion. His heating system is powered by natural gas, electricity and a backup generator, and the food reserves are enough for his family to eat for several weeks. When the line is operating normally, he handles business by phone, monitors the company's losses in real time, and decides when to resume operations. His main discomfort was boredom, the frustration of not being able to travel, rather than the inability to survive. Meanwhile, one of his factory workers spent the same week in a small rental house where the heating was getting worse and worse. The ration of food was supposed to last for 3 days, but later it was extended to 6 or 7 days. When the wood ran out, he burned the furniture in the fireplace. What the workers care about most is survival, followed by recovery, and then going back to work to earn the wages that were stopped being paid after the factory was closed. The empirical divergence along the class line is not new. Poverty always means being more vulnerable to disasters, but this storm has brought it to light in a way that is concealed in normal times. When everyone claims to be struggling, the extent of the struggle becomes obvious. The distinction between delayed luxury and delayed dining, and between inconvenience and true pain, are measured by the seemingly abstract resources before the storm materializes them. The social security network, which existed like that in 1978, has been tested in this storm and has deficiencies in many aspects. Emergency shelters have been set up in schools and community centers to provide warmth and food for the homeless, but the shelter itself relies on the infrastructure damaged by the storm. Electricity, food delivery, and staff can access them. Many people only exert part of their abilities. Making people leave is not because of a lack of willingness, but because of a lack of ability. Welfare systems that typically offer assistance through monthly checks and food stamps have found that they fail to provide benefits when offices are closed and mail cannot be moved. People who rely on regular assistance find that they have no resources precisely when they need it the most. Advocates who have long maintained that emergency systems should be designed to function in emergencies have more overlooked this irony. Churches and community organizations fill the gaps left by the government and the market. Although they have limited resources, they often have greater flexibility. The basement of a church was turned into a refuge because the priest had the key and made a decision to bypass the committee procedures required by the formal system. A community group distributes food from donated supplies without waiting for official authorization or coordination. These informal systems have saved lives and reduced suffering, but they have also exposed the vulnerability of relying on volunteer services to address systemic needs. By the time the storm ended, the pastor who ran the church had not slept for 3 days. Community organizers have exhausted their personal resources and borrowed money with future capabilities as collateral to meet immediate needs. This kind of assistance is genuine, but unsustainable. Emergency response has played a role in the crisis, but it cannot replace institutional capacity. This storm exposed the class structure that is usually politely ignored in American discourse. The geographical location of suffering follows that of wealth, with an undisturbed precision. Communities with newer houses and better infrastructure retain electricity for a longer time and restore it more quickly. After the recovery in the wealthier areas, the regions with older housing inventories and aging public facilities remained in the dark for several days. The explanation is technical. Newer areas had underground power lines that are less vulnerable to ice damage, better insulation materials that can retain heat for a longer time, and housing regulations require backup systems. But the technical explanation is also economic. The cost of these improvements determines where they are implemented. This storm did not cause inequality, but made it thermodynamically clear and visible, measured in Fahrenheit rather than in income percentiles. Urban planning concentrates poverty in specific communities, which means that already stretched emergency services are facing impossible triage decisions. Should the scarce snow removal resources be used for the main roads that serve everyone, or for the residential streets in poor communities where people's coping capabilities are relatively weak? The utilitarian answer prioritizes highways, but the labor cost falls on those who are least capable of bearing it. In most cases, the situation in the suburbs is better than that in the cities. Their lower population density and relatively new infrastructure provide the advantages brought by wealth. Suburban residents can rely on a variety of support systems. Neighbors with similar resources, owners associations with emergency funds, and local governments with strong tax-based support services. Under normal circumstances, the drawback of suburban life is isolation from the outside world, but when service industry collapses, it turns into an advantage. If you have resources, you can survive independently. This is usually the case for suburban residents. Rural areas are confronted with various challenges with a scattered population. Even under favorable conditions, it is difficult to make emergency responses. However, rural residents often possess skills and resources that urban residents lack. Wood miners burning stoves have replaced central heating systems. Wells have taken the place of municipal water supply. And neighbors will come to check on you, because this is the meaning of rural life. The independence that rural Americans take pride in is not only ideological independence, but also a practical need thousands of miles away. This storm has revealed that power, political, economic, and social, is basically all about choice. The rich have other options. The poor don't. Leave before the storm comes, stay elsewhere during the storm, and ask for help to recover after the storm. People who are connected have choices, while those who are isolated do not. Seek help, obtain information, and deal with bureaucracy. The difference between managing a crisis and being crushed by it usually depends on how many options you have. For the strong is a problem that needs to be managed and an obstacle that requires resources and planning. But it can be overcome in the end. For those who are powerless, This is a force that requires endurance and hope to get through, to survive with little ability to shape the outcome. Disagreements are not absolute. The rich also suffered the same pain, while the poor found resilience and community. However, the statistical pattern is clear in the aggregated data, which will be compiled later. The insurance claims processed after the hurricane clearly demonstrated this difference. Application for repair of heating systems, structural damage, artworks and furniture for high-value properties. Low-value properties, if they are insured, are used for basic survival needs, replacing damaged food, temporary housing costs, and minimum repairs. The gap between insured is itself a sign of class. Those with the weakest ability to bear losses are the least likely to receive insurance that can buffer losses. The response of the labor market to the storm reveals another aspect of the power imbalance. Salaried employees, especially those in white-collar positions, usually receive paid time during forced closures. Their compensation continues. Hourly workers, especially those in the service and manufacturing industries, will lose their wages once work stops. No job means no salary, and no salary means that people who are living in poverty are about to face an economic crisis. Some employers choose to pay workers wages during the closure period as a consideration of fairness or employee relations to bear the costs. Others, however, believe that when work becomes impossible, their duty is over, and the weather is a gift from God that has freed them from their normal employment expectations. This difference is usually related to trade union representatives, where organized workers obtain protection that unorganized workers lack through negotiations. The political response to the economic impact of the storm followed a predictable pattern, with different factions drawing different conclusions from the same event. Conservatives point out that the resilience of individuals and the response of communities prove that government aid is unnecessary or secondary. Liberals stress that the suffering of poor communities proves that the social safety net needs to be strengthened. Both sides are partially correct, which makes solving the problem impossible. The debate over federal disaster relief spending has become a representative of the larger debate over the role of the government, individual and collective responsibilities, and whether society has obligations to its most vulnerable members. This storm did not resolve these disputes. No single event could, but it provided new evidence that all parties could explain based on their previous commitments. Business leaders advocate for the rapid restoration of infrastructure to minimize economic losses and align their interest with the public interest. The factory is running, people are working, and the community is thriving. This argument is not entirely cynical. There is a true consistency between promoting enterprise development and enabling people to be employed. But this framework bears the question of who benefits the most from the rapid recovery and who bears the cost of underinvestment in resilience previously. Labor rights activists are advocating for worker protection and compensation for lost wages, arguing that workers should not bear costs they have not caused or are unable to control. This argument has moral strength, but it faces practical obstacles. The company claims that they are unable to pay for work that has not occurred, and doing so would threaten their ability to survive, thereby threatening future employment. The tension between short-term workers' demands and long-term corporate health is not easy to resolve. This storm has become a case study of disaster capitalism. This crisis has created opportunities for some people while also destroying others. Companies specializing in emergency response and reconstruction have seen huge demand and corresponding revenue. Suppliers of generators, heaters, and emergency supplies are depleting their inventories at a premium. The market's response to scarcity is exactly in line with what economics textbooks predict. The labor cost of this reaction has troubled people who have witnessed price fraud in what the market calls an efficient allocation. Hotels that are still in operation have charged extremely high prices for their rooms. Restaurants that offer food have raised their prices. The towing company requests to charge an additional fee for retrieving the stranded vehicle. In each case, the provider determines the price based on the supply and demand relationship, the additional costs it has incurred, and the value of the services it provides. These explanations are economically reasonable, but in the eyes of the accused, There are moral issues. The government's efforts to prevent price gouging are usually opposed. Price control reduces supply, causes shortages and disrupts the natural clearing mechanism of the market. But another option is to disproportionately let the cost of the storm fall on those who are least capable of paying, making the already vulnerable even worse off. This policy debate has brought up arguments as old as the market itself, and this storm is the latest backdrop to eternal tensions. The reconstruction contracts after the hurricane mainly flowed to those established companies that had existing relationships and rapid mobilization capabilities. Despite the fact that insurance companies, list of preferred suppliers and municipal contracts require competitive prices to be excluded, small contractors and new businesses still find it difficult to get opportunities. The economic consequences of the storm, just like the storm itself, have strengthened the existing structures rather than destroyed them. Some people see an opportunity in the economic recovery to reshape the system and build resilience rather than merely restore the original system. Advocates are promoting the upgrading of power grids, the improvement of emergency response systems, the strengthening of building codes, and the enhancement of communication infrastructure. But the efforts to promote improvement have encountered the reality of cost. Building better buildings is expensive, and paying the price for it either requires higher taxes or higher prices. In a region that has just suffered significant economic losses, both of which are politically challenging, the tension between reconstructions has been better demonstrated at numerous municipal and national planning conferences. Engineers and planners have presented cases of investment in resilience, demonstrating how the funds invested now can prevent greater losses in the future. Elected officials weighed these arguments against taxpayers' resistance and budget constraints, realizing that the political cost of spending would be direct, while the benefits of avoiding future disasters would be speculative. Ultimately, most jurisdictions chose restoration over transformation, replacing the damaged system with a similar one rather than a fundamentally better one. This choice makes sense. Limited resources need to address immediate demands first, but this means that the lessons learned may not necessarily translate into practical lessons for implementation. The next similar storm might find the same vulnerability as in 1978. This storm has revealed that economic systems, such as physical infrastructure, are optimal under normal conditions, but vulnerable when deviated from them. A supply chain designed for efficiency lacks redundant resilience. A power grid designed for typical loads cannot cope with extreme weather. A traffic network designed for flow has no ability to get clogged. Every optimization will create loopholes. Every kind of efficiency is achieved in exchange for cost savings through flexibility. The question raised but not answered by the storm is whether modern economic arrangements can incorporate weak resilience without sacrificing the efficiency that makes them productive. Can the system be designed to work properly and withstand pressure? Can redundancy coexist with optimization? The answer is not clear, but as the storm subsides and the analysis begins, these questions become more urgent. For those who have experienced it, the economic aspect is inseparable from the physical experience. The coldness you feel partly depends on the heating system you can afford. The food you eat depends on what you store and what you have the ability to store. The speed at which you recover is related to your insurance coverage, and savings class is not only about money, but also about the material conditions that money can buy and the buffer between you and disasters. This storm shows that it is an illusion that everyone is equal before nature. Everyone is confronted with the same weather, but not everyone faces it from the same position. The wind doesn't make a difference, but its impact depends on the quality of your shelter. Everyone but its danger depends on how you heat it. This kind of isolation is widespread, that the resources available to deal with it are not. In the following years, economists calculated the losses of the storm more and more precisely, and the figures calculated in 1978 currency approached or exceeded $1 billion. This figure is useful for comparison and policy discussion, but it cannot reflect the full economic impact of the storm, the lost opportunities, the businesses that go bankrupt after the storm, the lifetime income loss of those who die or become disabled, and the psychological costs that never appear on the ledger. The allocation of this kind of cost follows a predictable pattern and is concentrated in the countries with the lowest absorption capacity. The poor spent more of their income to make up for their losses and recover from the chaos. The working class has lost more wages relative to their income. The rich experienced inconvenience and some financial impacts, but rarely faced survival threats. This pattern is ancient and can be seen in every disaster in history. The disaster is most severe where the buffer is the thinnest. What this storm truly froze was not only roads and power lines, but also people's belief in progress, that progress is isolated from nature. For decades before this, people had always believed that technology and wealth fundamentally guaranteed civilization, and that disasters were problems for poorer countries and earlier times. The 1978 snowstorms reminded the Midwest and, through them, the whole country that safety is conditional and reversible, and that winter can still impose its terms regardless of economic development. Those elites who stand in isolation and watch may have realized that their power has limitations that they are reluctant to admit. The poor who have suffered the most have once again realized that the safety net of society is designed for normal times and will wear out under pressure. Everyone knows that the distance between comfort and crisis is shorter than they think. It is not measured in miles, but in the number of hours without electricity, in degrees below comfortable temperatures, and in fuel consumption rates and fuel availability. The economic impact of the storm has affected years of budget discussions and planning processes, influencing everything from insurance requirements to infrastructure investment and emergency management agreements. But the deeper impact is psychological. People have come to realize that wealth and power may temporarily lose their meaning due to the weather, and the systems that support modern life are far more fragile than their daily reliability suggests. As the ice and snow melt, business activities return to normal, factories resume operation, wages flow in again, the sense of urgency fades, but knowledge remains. Those who have experienced this storm have a fragile awareness. They realize that what keeps the ordinary world stable are systems that may fail, infrastructure that may break, and natural conditions that are still within control. This awareness did not paralyze them. Life goes on. People have made some adjustments, but this has permanently affected their sense of security. The frozen economy began to thaw after being disrupted, and economic growth returned to its normal pattern. But in a week in January 1978, the entire economic system of a region came to a complete standstill. It has been proved that all complex financial instruments and complex supply chains ultimately depend on the smoothness of roads, the flow of electricity and people's ability to reach their workplaces. For those who believe that the economic system is autonomous and self-sustaining independent of material conditions, this revelation makes them feel humble. This storm proved that nature still has the veto power over human plans. The cost brought by that winter still exceeded any reasonable preparation, and the progress of civilization did not eliminate the fundamental weakness. The evidence is written in the ice and snow, in the dark factory, and on the empty streets. This week, the power of economy, politics and technology has come to a standstill and shown that it is not as important as anyone is willing to believe. In this way, the great storm passed. All storms will eventually pass, leaving behind a landscape that has been changed and a group of people who have been altered by its past experiences. The snow that had fallen so mercilessly began to recede slowly, melting under the sun's rays. The sun returned with a weakness that was almost apologetic, as if feeling embarrassed for its absence during the crisis. The world has not returned to normal. Recovery is gradual. Roads are gradually cleared, and the areas damaged by the storm are patiently rebuilt. Power is slowly restored. We spent that week in January 1978 together, experiencing through imagination and detail what it meant to live in winter for the absolute authority of human planning. You may have experienced the coldness that pierces through the best defense. When familiar landmarks disappear beneath the white, a sense of loneliness follows. Watching the support of civilizations fail one after another is accompanied by a strange sense of fear and helplessness. People who experienced this storm underwent subtle changes after going through it, leaving their marks in some obvious and invisible ways. They know something that people who only read can never understand. They know what it feels like when modern comfort reveals that it is temporary and conditional. When the distance between safety and survival vanishes completely. When nature demonstrates its continuous power, despite human attempts to rule. But there are still some things worth taking back from this journey. Something more important than the specific details of that storm. The snowstorm in 1978 was extraordinary. Yes, its intensity is historical, its influence is exceptional, but it also represents something eternal and recurring. Every generation is confronted with the reminder that human control is partial and temporary, and that nature retains abilities beyond our control. This storm has taught us a lesson about preparation and resilience, the importance of communities, and the value of maintaining redundant systems rather than optimizing them purely for efficiency. People learned these lessons, then gradually forgot them as the direct threats receded, and then recalled them when the next disaster struck. This cycle is older than memory. Patterns of crisis and response, learning, unforgetting, confidence and humility. Tonight, as you rest in any comfort you've created for yourself, you might take some time to reflect on the contrast between your current moment and the cold week we've explored together. It froze under the regulation of the thermostat, the light that appears as soon as the switch is pressed. Food reaches your local store through a complex supply chain. These conveniences are so reliable that people can't see them and only notice them when they fail. In 1978, people took these conveniences for granted until the storm stripped them away, exposing the infrastructure beneath daily life. In your own life, most of these infrastructures are hidden, operating quietly behind the scenes, maintaining the temperature, light and connection you experience, just as usual. This snowstorm reminds us to pay attention to what we usually overlook, to appreciate effective systems, and to understand their vulnerabilities. Perhaps you are listening to this article in a warm and safe place, which is your own little refuge and can withstand any weather outside the world. Perhaps it is winter where you are. Or perhaps the seasons have changed, and the heat of summer, rather than the cold, weighs down on your windows. No matter where you are or what season it is around you, you are living in a moment that people in January 1978 have already recognized. Human consciousness is hidden in the structures we build, hoping that they are strong enough to withstand everything brought by nature. This storm has passed and ended decades ago. Its snow melts for a long time into soil, rivers and recycled water that sustains all life. Those who have experienced it have all grown old. Their child has a baby. Since that frozen week, the world has gone through countless seasons. But the memory still exists, in the stories and photos, in the changes in the survivors' eyes as they talk about it, and in their cautious respect for the winter weather, marking those who experienced that month. You may find yourself considering your preparations and getting ready for any possible damage. The lesson is not to live in fear. This storm is very rare. Most winters do not have such a dramatic event. But one must maintain an awareness of possibility, an awareness that the ordinary can become extraordinary at an astonishing speed. Keep a reasonable supply, be wise in responding to emergencies, and show respect, humility and vigilance towards the forces of nature. As you gradually fall asleep, let the story of the storm remind you of some comforting things. Human beings possess extraordinary adaptability. When crises call for it, communities will unite, and when the environment demands it, people will discover the abilities they were unaware of. The storm is terrifying, yes, but it also clarifies that at the same frozen moment, vulnerability and strength are revealed. During that week, most of the houses that provided shelter for these families remained motionless, and their walls had withstood the test of that winter. The previously impassable road was eventually cleared away and vehicles can still pass. The damaged power lines were repaired and humming to deliver electricity to millions of households. The infrastructure is still there. Although it is somewhat bent, it is not damaged. After an unusual week, Life has returned to its normal pattern. Let yourself be grateful for the comfort around you, for the comfort on the bed, for the roof, and for the walls that can maintain a comfortable living temperature without your conscious effort. These comforts are the result of countless efforts by several generations. Infrastructure is built and maintained by people you have never met, but their work supports your daily life. This storm has revealed how much we rely on these hidden systems and how difficult life becomes when they fail. But we should also have confidence in our ability to endure, adapt, and survive. People in 1978 were not supermen. They are ordinary people, yet they find themselves in a special environment and have done what is necessary. You have the same basic abilities and the same resilience under pressure. This knowledge may never be tested, and we also hope it won't be tested. But it still exists in a dormant state, yet it is available. The snow in January 1978 has been integrated into history, becoming a story and data, a memory and a lesson. The storm itself has already dissolved in the atmosphere it created. Its water molecules circulate in clouds and rain in rivers and oceans, and in the huge planetary systems that generate weather and climate. Apart from its influence, no material form of the storm will be left behind. The buildings it destroys, the lives it changes, and the memories it creates in those who have experienced it. However, in another sense, the storm still exists in people's awareness of the vulnerability it has caused in the policy changes it has triggered, and in the stories that have been repeatedly told in the following years. History is not merely about what happened, but about what we remember and how we remember it, the narratives we construct from events and the meanings we extract from them. The blizzard lies between facts and explanations, between events and meanings. When your eyes become heavy, your breathing slows down, and your mind releases its control over consciousness and gradually falls asleep, please carry this final thought: every era faces challenges, every era has storms, and everyone has moments of testing. The form has changed, but the fundamental situation of humanity remains unchanged. In this powerful world, we are vulnerable creatures, original and adaptable, but never completely safe, always relying on systems and forces that cannot be fully controlled. In 1978, people survived the storm and continued their lives, raising their families, pursuing their dreams, and experiencing joys and sorrows that had nothing to do with the winter weather. This storm was a week in a life spanning several decades, significant yet undefined, unforgettable yet not imprisoned. They learned their lessons but were not numbed by them. They respect winter but are not afraid of it. They prepared rationally but did not become paranoid. This might be the most profound lesson: we can admit our vulnerability, but we must not yield to anxiety, but not be intimidated by it. We can make wise preparations while still believing that most days will be ordinary. This storm is an exceptional case, but the exceptional case itself cannot define the normal situation. Most winters do not have catastrophic blizzards. Most days do not have crises. And most moments are relatively calm. Sleep now, if you can. Let the story of this storm disappear in the general drift of the historical consciousness carried by consciousness. You returned to January 1978 and experienced the feeling of that frozen week through details and imagination. You have walked through the cold, felt the loneliness, and understood the fear and strange beauty of the world reshaped by white. When you wake up tomorrow, you will find your time, your place, your season and the weather. The storm will fade from your memory, and this story will vanish against the backdrop of what you have learned. But perhaps you will have a little gratitude for the comfort you have, a little gratitude for the systems that support your daily life, and a little quiet respect for the continuous energy in winter, even though our technology has advanced. Now your breathing rhythm has slowed down. The weight of your body will settle more deeply when you rest. Outside your window, no matter what the weather is like, it will continue its eternal pattern. Wind and temperature, pressure and precipitation. The great atmospheric machine has created the climate in which we live. Sometimes machines produce gentle rain and breezes. Sometimes it is some extraordinary events that remind us of its power. The storm has passed. The snow has melted. Life continues its complex unfolding, carrying on the lessons learned, gradually forgetting them until the next reminder arrives and the cycle begins again. History operates in this way, and humanity experiences crises and recoveries, disasters and reconstructions, fears and ultimate consolations in this way. Don't worry, you are safe at the moment. The storm we explored together has long passed. Those who need to learn have already learned the lessons it has taught us. Rest in your current comfortable environment. Rest in your warm shelter. Rest on this special night. Let the story of that frozen week drift away like snow, melt into spring soil, nourish memories, but not disturb sleep. The world takes you through the darkness and towards another dawn. Somewhere at the turning point, all the storms that have been experienced and are about to be experienced exist only in possibilities, memories and stories. Tonight's story comes to an end here. The journey is over. The past releases you back to the present. Have a gentle dream. No matter what the weather is like tomorrow, be ready to face it when you wake up, with the resilience that humans have always possessed and the adaptability of our species to get through every storm bestowed by nature. Good night, everyone.